Good afternoon, everybody. I think we are beginning this conversation at a somewhat ironically appropriate context because we are talking about national security in the age of climate change, and we have a climate-related issue around us right now with this aircon dysfunctionality. But these are, I think, the rough sides that we will slowly need to get used to. But before I begin, I wanted to wish uh, everybody in this room, because yesterday and today bring in a variety of Indian New Years on the table, the Tamil, the Bengali, the Punjabi, the Malayali. So wish you all the very best to your respective folks for the new year. We have with us Natasha Garcha today to speak on the subject of redesigning national security in the age of climate change, the Athenian age. This is actually the product of a book that Natasha has written. And she will be taking us through these books. But I think what is interesting and what we would probably be very interested in looking at, given that as an institute we have a multi-specialization character because our work is divided across various verticals: security, economics, climate, international relations, politics. So what the work that you are going to share with us is going to bring us into is kind of this trijunction between the conflict dynamics, the migration pressures, and how those are influencing the subject of climate, and how climate is essentially something which can in no way any further be looked at just as climate. There's so much around climate that you bring onto the table. So we would be very keen on knowing that. And at the same time, what we are also looking forward to is the kind of solutions that you're proposing for moving forward. Because for some of you over here who were present at a roundtable that we had convened with the climate trends last year on the subject of carbon markets, Natasha was present on the occasion as a speaker. So based on that line of expertise of hers, where she has worked extensively in the industry, given her background in places like the Wall Street at D. Shaw and Company, and the investment markets and the industrial and financial sector expertise she brings on the table. We would be very happy to learn from her the various proposals for raising sustainable finance that are on the table, and the kind of ideas that she herself, and as well as through her experience, she can share with us. So very briefly, Natasha, of course, is somebody who has been at the Harvard. She has been with the Oxford, and prior to that, you're a law graduate, right? From the National Law School in Bangalore. And she eventually went on to work in a number of areas, which I just alluded to. But most importantly, I think right now she's a senior director at the Impact Investment Exchange based here in Singapore. And she also is the architect of the Orange Bond Principles, a pioneering global framework that has mobilized more than $1.5 billion towards gender responsive climate solutions. So that's something very interesting, and we will look forward to hearing more about that from her. So with that, Natasha, please get on to your slides and presentation. We are looking forward to hearing and learning from you. I think around 30 minutes. Is that okay with you? And then we can open up the floor for the conversation. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Palit. And I will say I've been a long-term admirer of all your work and your leadership. So thank you very much for everything you've done to put South Asia into many conversations in and beyond Singapore. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. I will try to keep this session fairly interactive. I think we're a small enough group to stop me if you have questions in between as well. That's fine with me. Happy to keep this fairly engaging. But I'll first start with, one of the things that really struck me is this twin crisis. And we are, as a species, very good at drawing artificial borders. We draw it between our countries, we draw it between genders, we draw it between nationalities, ethnicities, even when we have a lot in common. And we've unfortunately also done it with issues that we're facing. We typically feel like climate and conflict are two different issues. But as you'll see on the map here, most of the conflicts that we are fighting right now have climate change as a threat multiplier. And most of the wars we're fighting are aggravating climate change. It's unfortunately a vicious circle between the two. Over the last 40 years, 60% of the conflicts that have been fought have really been aggravated by climate change. And I think especially if you look at the hotspots in the bright pink color, those are the really hot zones. And unfortunately, we're in one of them. And this map, unfortunately, will rapidly evolve in light of what's going on right now in the Middle East. I do not call it the Iran war. I usually call it the US-Israel-Iran war, just because that's who's fighting. And so a question to the audience, but now that we, the map establishes that climate and conflict are not isolated issues from each other. It's a twin crisis. What do you think is the greatest predictor of climate security? Whether a state will or will not go to war with another state in light of energy security, water security, food security, everything that's pressured by climate change. I'll start you off with one of the predictors that people usually say. Religion. Religion has long been used as something that people think is one of the greatest predictor of whether a state is or is not peaceful. Who's fighting the war right now? What's the dominant religion of the United States? Christian. Israel? Jew. Iran? There's no correlation. This, when I ran a regression analysis, was the weakest correlation of all indicators. I wouldn't even say it's correlated at all. We live in Singapore, one of the most diverse countries in the world. And I have learned, the biggest lesson I've learned from Singaporean friends is diplomacy. They're excellent at it. What about latitude? Anyone thinks latitude is an influencing factor? In most countries, when I do this in Europe, people say yes. They think all of us in the global south are doomed. And then I point out I'm from Singapore. I think we're the second greenest country in the world after Denmark, and certainly one of the most peaceful in the region. So latitude, very weak indicator. We are often pressured more because of where we are geolocated. However, latitude is not a predictor of a country's inherent likelihood to want to engage in war. What about democracy? Anyone thinks democracy is one of the key predictors? There's no wrong answer. This is actually a stronger predictor than most others, is whether or not you have a democratic government. But there are extreme outliers. You all read the news. I don't need to name who they are. But there are extreme outliers when you look at democracy. Wealth and GDP, stronger predictor than the other three. And I think this is interesting because when you have more to lose, you have more to protect in most cases. Again, there are always exceptions, but by and large, when I did a regression analysis of 171 countries, democracy and wealth are stronger predictors than things like latitude and religion. But nothing was fully explaining how you can really pinpoint something in a very stable way until I ran one predictor, which is gender equality. And this is fascinating for me. And again, I'm not saying this just as a woman. You will see this side of the room. My argument is not going to be to replace all of you with all of them. That's not why I'm here. It's interesting because how you treat a penalty-free target at home is how you think you can treat someone who's weaker than you in foreign policy. If you feel someone who's weaker than you at home physically can be dominated, and that's normalized in culture, it does seep into how you may act on the global stage. It's a predictor, I would say. And much of this has to do with social dominance orientation. Does a culture allow, normalize, accept one group dominating another, gender-wise? If you add in race, I think that's another very interesting predictor. When you add gender and race together, when you just look at race, all of us in South Asia, I'm sure at some point we've understood the meaning of discrimination in a very different way than some of our counterparts in other parts of the world. So that is one of the telltale signs. also gender equality would be a predictor of climate security. Imagine if half of your population is not engaged in the workforce, not engaged in the green transition, does not have green skills, is not got the same access to resources. You will be inherently weaker, even if it's not from a cultural point of view, from a pure economic point of view. You will have less at your disposal to fight climate change with. And that leaves you more exposed to those risks, especially in times of war. Now, most of you, given what I just said, can you point out what's interesting about this photo? It's mostly men. So 8 out of 78 world leaders attending COP29 were women. That's a telltale sign of why climate policy tends to work in a certain way. Again, this is just a symptom of who reaches the top. There are many instances of female leaders who are not pro-climate. There are instances of female leaders who are not pro-feminism. So the argument is, again, not to replace all the men with women, but it's that equality. When you have equal number of teams, that diversity of perspectives is really the strength that brings to any climate conversation or any peace and security conversation, because they will look at things differently. Now, as I said, 40% of the conflicts in the last 60 years were over natural resources. Interestingly, when you flip it, over the last 40 years, it was 60%. So we are on a trend. $14 trillion of annual costs are going into this. So there's a lot at stake in terms of the economy as well. And if you want to put this in terms of lives, 23 million climate refugees exist today. And that's only going to go up after what's just happened in the Middle East. Climate finance has to rise 5 times for us to address the conflict and the crisis that we are seeing. And military spending is at an all-time high. It's about $2 trillion the same year that we have global economy contracting by about 4%. This is called a scissor effect. We have less resources and we're spending more on defense. I come from a family of defense. I believe in defense. However, when defense changes to attack unprovoked or attack, especially when you are energy insecure and there are different motivation factors of why you're attacking another nation, that's when things go askew. And in basic game theory, if one country has nuclear power, everyone else wants it. It's basic game theory. And so that's the issue that we're facing right now, is that scissor effect. And the execution gap, unfortunately, despite all the data pointing towards gender equality being so strong, is women-led organizations receive less than 1% of funding for peace and security initiatives. So the question is, can we afford to sideline half of the knowledge, the agency, the leadership of the population at a time like this? That's the real question. I want to show you also just visually, talking about what the indicators are. But when I actually mapped this out, I thought it was really interesting. So this clearly shows the global peace index on the y-axis, and you'll see the ND gain, which is the climate security index, on the x-axis. And you see there's a correlation, right? The more insecure countries, the more likely they are to go to a war. They're also less green. But you'll see 2 clear quadrants. And when you add gender equality as a layer, you'll see the more gender equal countries are the ones that are both more climate secure and more pro-peace. And that's where it starts getting interesting. It gets even more interesting when you don't just look at war and conflict and security, because peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is supposed to be when human security can actually flourish, when all of us can actually be our best selves, right? That is true peace that we are all meant to be achieving. So it's the same. I kept the climate readiness index on the X index, and I put the positive peace index on the y-axis. And you overlay gender security, it's the same pattern. So whichever way you look at it, whether you're pro-peace or anti-war, you'll see there is a strong correlation. And again, this is not women in charge. This is gender equal nations. There's no nations where women are predominantly in charge anyway. So even if I wanted that data set, it doesn't exist. But gender equality, there's definitely something there. So if gender equality is climate security, or is one of the greatest predictors of climate security, what does that really mean? Interestingly, I talked about a number of different pieces of regression analysis: latitude, religion. Religion didn't have any correlation, but latitude, democracy, wealth can explain to a large extent your climate security. But when you add gender inequality, you can actually improve your predictive power by at least 10%. And that's when it gets really interesting. So whether you look at it at different levels, you look at it at the national level, you'll see that these countries, as I've shown you, are more climate secure. You could look at it even in a corporate level. You know, as Dr. Palit shared, I started my work experience at a hedge fund back during the financial crisis. I was the minority in the room, both for my race and my gender. But it was really interesting because when the financial crisis hit, that was the time that the glass ceilings broke, both for Asians. We are good at maths. That's one of the things we're very good at. And for many women, we tend to diffuse tension a bit better. It's one of the skill sets women have. Instantly, I found myself promoted. And interestingly, D. Shaw and many other hedge funds, 5 years later, the data came out. If you had a gender equal team, again, not an all male, not an all female team, a gender equal team, you were outperforming the market by 6%. That's a lot for a hedge fund. We fight for every basis point. I was up all night last night negotiating 10 basis points with an investor. 6% is huge. That's 600 basis points. And so clearly, again, it's because of the unique lived experiences that women have and will bring to the table. And that's really what I call the Athenian edge, is this approach of, you'll see it comes from Greek mythology. There's two gods of war. There's Athena, and she fights with strategic wisdom. And then there's Ares, and he fights with systematic weaponization. And I think that's a really interesting parallel between the two, because both of them inherently, when you read Greek mythology, still want to win. So it's not that women are just more peaceful. They just fight the same wars differently. There may be less bloodshed. There may be more cooperation. There may be more strategic use of assets. I remember we were I am a law student, but one of the most depressing things I've ever studied is human rights law. Which is why I'm not a lawyer, I'm in finance. And so there was this case in Sudan, I believe, where two warring factions were fighting over a piece of land. And it was very, very tense in the room. And both of them wanted that piece of land. And the woman pouring the water asked them, she figured out that this was probably because a river runs through the land. And, river, water is life. We spend billions of dollars exploring space for water. And Artemis just came back from the moon. And she said, oh, you should probably know the river dried up 2 years ago. And women knows this because women spend 250 million hours a day collecting water. That's 3 times more than men. It's just a different skill set that they happen to bring to the table. It's not inherently that she would be a better negotiator than every other man, but she would have those unique lived experiences just by virtue of what she's been exposed to. And so it's very interesting when you see so many of these cases. I'm just giving you one example of the unique strategic edge they can bring to the table if they have a seat at the table. And that's what really led me to design the Athenian Edge framework. And I will be happy to pass you all a copy. I think many of you have this on your table already. When I looked at conflict, it seemed cyclical, unfortunately. We're all in waves of conflict. There are very few nations in the world who've never been at war. And when you look at this wave and you add on climate, there's 12 dimensions of climate security that typically influence each wave. When you're at your most peaceful, right in the north part of this compass, if you will, when you're in a state of stable peace is when you typically can focus on prevention as a nation. You would focus on investments in energy. You would focus on carbon market policies. You would focus on making green manufacturing. You would focus on transportation. Singapore is a great case of green transportation, and they can afford to do that because they're in a period of stability. Also, when you're in a period of stability, you usually have wealth. When you have wealth, you're likely having higher emissions. There's a big climate justice argument, especially for those of us in South Asia. Many of us, the pushback is we didn't create the climate crisis, but here we are being accountable to reduce our emissions, especially if you're from countries like India. it is a very unique position to be in when we have not historically our emissions are not that high, but currently they are. So what do you do in those circumstances? If you move slightly down on the axis on the right-hand side for me, right-hand side for me here, left-hand side for me this way, you'll see we look at the protection edge. So here is where you will see emerging conflicts are going to put pressure on food systems, on water systems, and on habitat. What happened last year with India and Pakistan? Water was being weaponized. Water, a basic human right, was being weaponized by our countries. And I think that's exactly the kind of pressure point we see, even when, I'm going to talk about the Iran war a bit later, the Iran, US, and Israel war, and the issues that it has on food security. As you see conflicts emerge, even if you're not in the conflict, because the globe is so connected right now, these are the 3 dimensions of climate insecurity you will face. And then finally, when you go into a state of deep war, what gets hit the most? Early warning signs, recent shocks. This is basically when you have increased pressures from things like floods or natural disasters can be devastating to a country already at war. And then infrastructure gets hit. Most of the war that's going now is attacking infrastructure. And then finally, if you look at as countries come out of war, what becomes the priority again? Building, in the investment language, we call this ESG. You look at environment, social, and governance related issues, right? Your economy starts becoming important again. So it's these dimensions of climate security that can be mapped into how people typically prioritize their national security issues. So what was missing for me is the gender piece. And so I put that at the heart of the framework. These are the 4 pillars of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. These are not made up words. Prevention, protection, belief and recovery, and participation are the 4 core pillars. And they actually map very nicely to this 12 dimensions of climate security at different phases of where you are in your state of national security. And so that's the essence of the framework. Being a practitioner, for me, that was not enough. So what you'll see and what I will dive into a little bit today is what do you do when you figure out where you are on this compass? What kind of solutions should you explore? For me as a practitioner, the rest of this part of the framework was interesting, but so what? What do you do? This part of the framework, when you can start looking at the finance axis in the yellow, and you can start mapping things based on risk and return. If you are in a state of stable peace, you can aim for higher returns, you can take more risk. If you're in a state of low peace, it's a risky environment for investors, and you have to have a different kinds of investment solutions that come in. And I'll give you examples of all of these later. Same with the policy side. When you're in a state of stable peace, you will look for policies beyond your borders. You will look at just transition policies. You will look at carbon markets. When you're in a state of war, you will have to think about transitional justice post the conflict. It's very different solutions that you need to be prioritizing. So this basically maps them out and gives examples in the book of what people have actually done. So none of this is hypothetical. All I have done in some cases is add a gender lens and show what strength that could bring to a conversation or a solution. The case study map I'm flashing up here from the book I don't have time to go into all of them, so I'll just make one point. The point is that peace does not belong just to the West or just to the North. There are examples of peace and security from all over the world. New Zealand, Singapore, Indonesia, Bangladesh, even if you look at Cox's Bazar, and I'll go into an example particularly from Cox's Bazar and what women are doing there. Colombia's energy minister and environment minister, Minister Mohammed, is a pioneer in getting the loss and damages fund going for COP. So it does not just belong to one part of the world. And now diving into the interesting part, which is what does this mean for South Asia? So in South Asia, here are 2 examples of countries that are struggling on many of these parameters. Afghanistan is in a state of deep gender apartheid. There's a participation gap when it comes to women. Women are absolutely stripped of their rights over there. And you can see their rankings, whether it's on the gender index, the global peace index, or the climate ND gain index. They're among the lowest in the world. Not a coincidence. Sri Lanka, a little bit better, but right now, deep in the energy security crisis. Yesterday, again, I was negotiating the 10 basis points with an investor. And it's really because one of our portfolio companies is in Sri Lanka. And we have to protect them because right now they are so badly hit by what's happening with the Middle East. So again, the reliance that you have, one of these things, I found these photographs really interesting. On one side, you see women lined up, and it's all women lined up because they're being excluded from going into university. And on the other side, you see in Sri Lanka, all men lined up waiting for energy. And if there was equality, these pictures could look different. Maybe there would have been solutions that one group would have thought of that the other didn't. So either way, this is not sustainable. And then there's lots of stories of hope. South Asia, my message is not that South Asia is doomed. South Asia, we are one of the most resilient people in the world. India, this is one of my favorite case studies from the book, is a group called SEWA. We all think Bangladesh started microfinance, and Professor Muhammad, he did make it very popular, but it was actually started in India by a group called SEWA, by a woman who designed the idea. And one of the things that they did as India got extremely hot over the last couple of years was introduce parametric insurance. So if the temperature rises above 40 degrees Celsius, everyone in the cooperative who's a woman actually gets a payout. And that allows her to continue to grow her crops. And that allows her to continue to build food security. It's a fantastic example of how financial products can be designed with a gender lens and a climate lens. Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, it's a wonderful story of how there was a particular program called the IOM Women's Participation Program, and they shifted women from just recipients of aid as refugees in the Rohingya refugee camps to governance committees. And once women had power, they started collaborating with the men to change many things. One of the interesting things they changed was they put up solar panels so that there would be light at night, so there would be less gender-based violence. Women think of that because we're more exposed to gender-based violence. They put up fences around areas where children were falling in and getting injured. And they cooperated with the other side. Rohingyas were cooperating with local Bangladeshis, again, because women didn't see themselves as separate. They all were worried about the kids. They weren't worried about, I'm from here, you're from there. Those barriers broke down very quickly. And one of the interesting things is when we interviewed the men reported that the women were more likely to share relief funds during times of flood with other families. And this is because they have a social network. They are deeply reliant on each other. It's not because they're better people. Their social wiring is different. And so that's the kind of strength that they bring. Now, what does this mean when we talk about Iran, Israel, and US and the war that's going on right now? So first, in the prevention edge, all of us know Iran, 7th largest oil producer. You're all reading the news. You know what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz. We're all going to get basically choked on 20% of the oil, possibly stopping in the next few days. The last few barrels would have reached where they're going to reach. And it's interesting how you can use the Athenian edge in this case. Women are more likely to make green choices. And this is, again, not because they are greener than men. It's because women tend to have more caretaking responsibilities. They're more attuned to the next generation. When you do the same study on men who share care burdens at home, they are equally likely to make green choices. So it's not that she's more likely to be green than you are. It's based on the responsibilities you're given by your societies, you will make certain choices. And that's why equality benefits both groups. And that's the argument there. Protection edge, food and water security. As I already mentioned, women spend more time collecting water. Again, if men spend equal amount of time, they would have the same insights on water stewardship. Women grow 70% of the food that you eat, but they own less than 2% of the land. Again, a big opportunity to create equality because they would have different insights for adaptation at times when food insecurity has spiked up. One of the big reasons we are currently structuring an orange bond that's investing in women is because we know that women will grow more of the food. They're more food secure. And at this point, I would like to invest in a group that's going to ensure that India, the country that I'm investing in with an agri lens, remains food secure despite everything that's happening. Relief and recovery edge. One of the interesting cases from the book that I had to fight quite a bit to keep in was a case study on Israel and Palestinian women who were actually cooperating before the 7th October strikes to protect critical infrastructure. And it was such a powerful case because these women had advanced levels of peace talks before the war unfortunately escalated. And again, they were thinking about protecting infrastructure because women have more to lose for gender-based violence and other reasons. They're not the main combatants of war, but they're the main victims. They're inherently more likely to protect said infrastructure. And so that was really interesting case of cooperation between those women. And it's very similar to what we're seeing in Cox's Bazaars. They don't care whether they're from the Rohingya refugee camps or they're local Bangladeshi women. There's a lot of cases of cooperation. And again, when you add women to the groups where the men hold the power already, you see that strengthen even further. Participation edge is the last one. On the governance side, again, we are seeing women peace builders being sidelined, even though when UN Women came out with this really interesting data point. If you have women at a peace talk, the likelihood of that agreement lasting for at least 15 years spikes by about 35%. That's something we could really use right now, again, because conflict, unfortunately, is cyclical in nature. So as much as we can delay it would help us. Again, it was not because the women are more peaceful. It's because of the difference of insights they could bring to the table of things that the men may not have considered. And vice versa. All women peace talks, like we saw in Israel-Palestine, also led nowhere. There were no men at the table. Men who had positions of power were simply missing. So either way, it doesn't work. We all have to cooperate and work together. Quick set of guidance from the book of what to prioritize for South Asia. On the finance access, I think this is the time for blended finance. This is not the time for us to go and work in silos. Blended finance means you would build in different layers of capital structure. So for instance, I'm issuing an orange bond. That orange bond will have large, the last orange bond I'll issue, which is easier to talk about something that's already in the market in 2025. We had senior bond note holders, which is pure private sector. People like PayPal, MetLife, Nuveen, the Dutch pension fund have bought that. Yeah.
Just for the benefit of others, could you very briefly explain what's an orange bond?
Oh, yeah, of course. So an orange bond, orange is the color of UN SDG 5. UN SDG 5 is focused on gender equality. The UN has 17 goals. Every goal has a color. Usually you will talk about green investments because UN SDG 13 is green and it focuses on climate action. And it's the same concept that's borrowed for UN SDG 5 being orange, focusing on orange bonds. So when you're designing an orange bond, which has a blended finance structure, it means I'm still selling to these large private sector players, but they don't want to invest in India at a time like this, or Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Philippines, all the countries that were in my portfolio right now. There's a high level of risk perception right now. What do? We bring in a guarantee partner. Right now, Sweden is our guarantee partner. Sweden is a AAA rated government. If there is a loss, Sweden can absorb some of that loss. That's an example of blended finance in action. That's critical for Asia right now, is that we use every dollar we get very strategically. We don't need Sweden giving us all the money. We just need them reducing the risk perception of investors across the world, investors who will be faster, more agile, and have much more money than actually, quite frankly, Sweden's aid budget would be able to give us. So that's what I mean about being strategic with blended finance. Risk sharing is very important. Things like crop insurance, the example I gave from Seva, how they're making sure that the women farmers have access to this crop insurance. So when things go south, which they will, there are more incidents of droughts than we've ever had. You have things that will protect. It's not just about lifting women up, it's also building those safety nets. Things we need to redesign very quickly, remittances. I think given what's happened in the Middle East, all of you must have read remittances have crashed, and that is affecting South Asia extremely badly. And one of the things that we can do very quickly is break the gender digital divide. Men are still more likely to be able to get money back home than women because of digital literacy. And so I think, again, this is such a quick fix problem that would solve things for everyone, not just benefiting the women, but their families back home. Official development assistance, this is basically aid budgets. The era of aid ended last year when USAID was dismantled. We can no longer wait for aid agencies to help countries like, especially countries like India, where we have our own strengths right now. We have our own resources. We must reform how we use ODA budgets. And shifting them to guarantees is a fantastic example. Say Sweden, instead of giving us a grant, guarantee something that will help me leverage in 10 times more funding from the private sector. That's how you use blended finance to leverage, and that's how you redesign aid budgets. So that's what I would propose for Asia right now on the finance axis based on the diagnosis that I did. For the policy axis, just transition policy is more important than ever. We can't have net zero action plans which are not gender responsive, where we're leaving half of the population out who are not going to access these jobs. We don't have the time. It's not even a justice argument right now. We don't have the time to wait for half the population to catch up. Carbon market policies. The interoperability is critical for us right now. We cannot work in silos. We can have the most beautiful carbon market, but if there's lack of interoperability, we're going to do ourselves a huge disservice. Things to redesign are national security strategies. Many countries in the world have a Women, Peace and Security Action Plan. I've reviewed some of these countries in South Asia that could include them, and some of the countries are designing them, are much better positioned to have, say, women at those peace talks alongside the men and help to potentially defuse cases of tension. And then transitional justice. And this is more relevant for countries that are coming out of states of conflict. There are amazing examples from countries like Rwanda, where they also have judges who are women, again, who will look at things differently, not better, but differently. And we need that in countries like, say, Bangladesh, which is coming out of or Sri Lanka, which are coming out of periods of internal stress. So all of that is very important right now. Orange bonds, just another quick spotlight, have been used all over the world for different cases. And I think this is something I'm very happy to say that Asia is the biggest market for orange bonds as of today. It grew while markets have been crashing. Asian orange bond market grew by 30% in Q1 of 2026, despite the war. The biggest orange bond in the world is actually from Indonesia. It's a $1 billion orange bond. It's a quasi-sovereign orange bond. India is one of the biggest countries in my portfolios for the orange bonds I structure using blended finance. Japan came out with a corporate orange bond. So there are many different structures people can use. Corporates are issuing them, countries are issuing them like Indonesia, and then organizations like mine are partnering with banks like Standard Chartered, and we're issuing these blended finance orange bonds, which are targeting markets like India and Sri Lanka. And so I think this is a really interesting time. And the reason the orange bonds have taken off is because when the orange bond principles were written, and again, I had the honor of being the original architect, but I co-authored them with people across the world. And I did this because when I was working on the green bond principles, I was the minority in the room, not a gender minority. I was usually the only Asian in the room, definitely the only South Asian. And I think there was one other Southeast Asian in the room. And I remember everyone would say, oh, Europe has the most number of green bonds, but Asia has such a big population. Why aren't you doing more green bonds? And I'm like, this, we're not at the table. You know, I'm half of the world population as a woman. I'm 1/6 of the world population as an Indian. And yet I'm the only one here. There has to be something wrong with that. So when we wrote the Orange Bond Principles, we had representation from all 6 continents. High representation from Asia, just because we're based here. And that's why, despite everything that's going on, when everything happened in the US and Europe last year, budgets got shifted towards Ukraine. US has its own backsliding on ESG. Orange bonds took off here in Asia. So that's a moment of pride for us, actually. So I wanted to leave on that very high note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha. In fact, it was very illuminating, and not just illuminating. I think you brought into conversation a large number of subjects in a very integrated manner, and that I really think is the unique part of the work and the research that you've been doing. So, congratulations again on the book and the work, and for taking us through this learning journey. I hope we'll have more opportunities to come back to you on the later stages of research that you develop here. So let me now open up the floor for questions. We will have Natasha with us for another 20 minutes, I hope, before you have to join a call. Yeah, anybody who wants to start? Yeah, Ronajan.
I just had a question as a sort of historian of sorts on the, the nomenclature, the Athenian age. Is it only a reference to Athena, or is there some more Greek mythology that you, or Greek history that you drawn for this term, which is, very interesting?
I tried various gods and goddesses from various cultures. I tried Saraswati, who's also the goddess of wisdom as well, for full disclosure. Athena was only because it was interesting because it was the only mythology which had two gods of war, and they had such different approaches. And Athena's full approach was based on strategic wisdom, and Ares' full approach was based on brute force. And so it fit in very well to the distinction that I was trying to draw, is when you use one, the kind of situations you get into with, as we're seeing unfortunately unfold now in the Middle East, is very symbolic of one of the cases that I had written in the book. And then Athena, on the other hand, still fighting, but fighting a climate war instead, fighting it with strategic wisdom, looking to protect, to avoid bloodshed. Very much like China's art of war, if you will. You know, when you can evade, you evade. Winning is not always about dominating, and that's why I chose that particular combination. But I actually reviewed many different pieces of mythology, and I'd be very happy to dive into it with you. Athena herself is not perfect, and I think that was an important one for me because I also feel that women are sometimes then held to very high standards of excellence. And I think that's also unrequired and sometimes uncalled for. We're human, just like you are. We make mistakes, just like you do. There's just that strength that comes with equality, and when you fight with that joint wisdom that I appreciated about the term. For full disclosure, I have a son, and I do not dislike men. I genuinely, the argument is very pro equality and having everyone at the table.
Yeah, the next. Anybody from this set? Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had one question on the last slide where you mentioned the finance.
Can I just interrupt? If you'd kindly introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm Supriti Besbara, and I'm actually a researcher on international development and gender issues. So this was very close to what I'm working on. So my question actually was on the policy edge aspect that you mentioned, and some of the things that you've said about, you know, having gender responsive plans, net zero, etc. How far has that been? I mean, it's already there in a lot of the plans and in the UN documents, and, you know, women's organizations have been advocating. How far have governments in the region, including in South Asia, actually taken it on board? What's happening on the ground, I guess? Yeah.
No, that's a great question. And I think this is, you know, the mistake that we've made is, again, I started this talk, we're talking about we're very good at drawing artificial boundaries. And one of the most damaging ones is the one between policy and finance. Most of the policy documents I've worked on with the UN, and I've worked with UN Women, UNDP, UNFCCC, give all the acronyms. I think I've worked with about 7 of them, and they're all wonderful in their own right. The biggest reason why I don't see something implemented 2 years down the line is funding, usually. And it's the same. A lot of the funding, like green bonds, is what, $5 trillion asset class. Yet here we are in this energy crisis, is because very misguided by policy, very, very weak policy oversight. And I think because we've kept them so separate, and that's one of the reasons in the framework I've drawn them as 2 parallel axes. I don't think one can work without the other. It may work on a small scale, it may work in a micro location, but to change a system, we absolutely need both. And I think that's where we're falling short is, you know, I just finished commenting on, you know, COP has a gender action plan, and I commented on that. And then, you know, at the end I said, how are we going to fund this? And no one knew. Just devastating. So now we're trying to design an orange-green bond to fund it, fund one of the solutions that was come up with there. But I think that's the issue usually with the UN. All respect to them. I think they do excellent work in many regards, but I think we have to solve both.
Thank you so much. I'm Kanika from ISAS. My question was more about the predictor of security. And I just was curious about the quantitative aspect of it and also the direction of causality. Because previously in grad school, I also did a bit of research. This is also an area I'm very curious about. So I had a bit of a research about like a full like grad school project on India-Pakistan engagement on terrorism and how it impacts women in Kashmir. And I tried my level best to make people understand why it was important and that there was a causality there. But in my research, it was the other way around, that I found that the kind of engagement the two countries were taking and the kind of approach they took actually determined the well-being. So I was just kind of curious about, when you were researching the quantitative relationship between them, if you thought that the relationship was bidirectional. So not only does domestic gender inequality influence external behavior and resulting peace or conflict, but also heightened security environments or external conflict dynamics that affect or worsen the inequality? Or how do you identify what causes what?
Yeah, I think that's exactly why they're made as circles, is because they're all influencing each other. Unfortunately, as one, you can't move one part of the dial down without the other moving down. And similarly, if you move one up, you would see the other two moving up. So I do think it's bidirectional. So that's a very astute observation you had. I'm glad we had the same observation, or your data is right then. I think one of the interesting things about that is that means that we always think there must be a top-down solution. And that's not necessary, actually. There are many instances where bottom-up solutions have also been scaled up. I think microfinance actually is one of the strong stories that we have. One of the only things I'm still investing in is the microfinance industry, because it tends to be uncorrelated with the other asset classes right now. I remember when I was at the hedge fund and the financial crisis broke out and all the funds were gating in 2009. One of the best investments you could have made was microfinance. They were doing fine. Their portfolio at risk ratios were abnormally low, just because they were less dependent. If the woman can't go to the market and buy tomatoes because it costs too much, she usually has a small garden at the back where she's growing them. It's things of that nature which you wouldn't see on a global stage. And so I think the hopeful factor is that the grassroots initiatives are also quite important and are quite telling of how you could eventually propel top-down change. But again, I do think the top-down change is also very necessary, especially when you are in a state of extreme conflict. We can't wait for every small grassroots initiative. And if you do have to have the kind of funding to scale it up very quickly.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I had a couple of questions. One about the peace index. If you could talk about like what the index was, and because I was thinking like what exactly is being captured in that piece, right? Like, is it only interstate conflict? Is it internal conflict? Like, how do we capture it and how do we think about it, right? Like, and also there might be some endogeneity in terms of data as well, right? Like gender violence, is that also a reflector of peace index? Then it becomes a little bit of a closed loop. So how does it work? And the other is, I was just thinking, it's a very interesting approach that you had of marrying climate change with security, right? Like those two, national security, those two ideas. And there is some inherent tension in them. And especially from a hard military perspective, right? Like there's a lot of tension. I mean, India maintains a huge outpost on Siachen Glacier, and that's just so ungreen. Like it's the opposite of green in many ways, right? Like so much of national security is. So how does that then, how does the framework then apply in that and like overcome that tension in some ways, right? Like how does that work?
Excellent question. So the peace index, that was the issue when I ran it only with the global peace index. And that really does look at things like interstate conflict, the likelihood of you going to war with another state. It looks at your level of internal conflict. It's basically, the premise is some form of violence. And that's where, and interestingly, gender-based violence was not a factor. I think in more recent indices, like there is a Women, Peace and Security Index where it's a big factor. And that's also my issue with the Women, Peace and Security Index is it's so only just women and the gender lens. And I don't also, despite being a woman, think that's the only lens we should use. We have to use many different lenses. These are complicated issues. We're not going to dismantle our defense systems because they're not green, which is in foreshadowing my next answer. But that's what GPI looked at. And that's why I ran it also for the positive peace index. And that looks at more things like human security. How water secure are you? How food secure are you? Do you have, what are your what's your energy security situation, especially when something like this happens? Do you have reserves that will last? It blows my mind that some countries like Australia have 30 days of reserves. It's not always that the West is doing this perfectly and we're not. And so I thought the positive peace index, which looks at more human security, was much more comprehensive to say, how resilient are you actually to shocks and stresses because you have developed all these aspects of human security? Whereas the global peace index looks more at national security. How likely is it that your political systems will crumble due to something internal? How likely is it that your foreign policy will be aggressive? That's the premise of it. Gender-based violence, sorely missing, except from the Women, Peace and Security Index, which, as I said, I had other, is very interesting, but hopefully it will evolve to have more lenses. Green, the defense system, again, I think the issue is game theory. We simply cannot afford to not have a strong defense system if everyone around us is going to have a strong defense system, if we are still going to be subject to terrorist attacks. I live very close to the border. Last year, I would call my parents and I would hear drones in the background. It's terrifying. And so I think I think that's where we have to all appreciate that the pathway is not to choose between them, but to see how we rebalance our budgets, how we build policies that will build those alliances instead of break them down. And I think actually India is trying to do a lot of that. So that we can de-escalate wars ourselves, even when other people like to take credit for them. Usually we're quite good at de-escalating wars ourselves also. There is a lot of talk of how can you make defense systems more green. We are so far away from that. Our manufacturing systems are not green. It will be a long time before I think our defense systems are fully green or carbon neutral. It's a long time away. It's not impossible, though. There's lots of talks and lots of research on how that can be done. But I think the problem is the need for the defense system at all, the budgets for militarization versus the budgets for peace. Whereas if there was more of a balance, we could be investing in a lot more green and have less need for things that are defense. But again, if everyone around us is not doing that, it makes it extremely hard. It's the same, and that's why it's a very parallel issue to climate change. Carbon emissions don't know borders. They will affect us all. And so for us also, that's one of the things that brings me back to the climate justice argument. We can't just say, we didn't create climate change, why must we solve it? If we are responsible for it now, we must take action to solve it. In fact, if we were more energy secure, maybe I would have got some more sleep last night rather than negotiating 10 basis points because my portfolio has India in it. So I think it's all these things, as Dr. Palit kindly pointed out, are so interlinked in the framework. And that's I hope, the power of it is it won't just show you one solution. If a national security strategy is showing you that you need more gender, it will also show you pathways of making it more green, but also balancing it with where you are as a country yourself. So it's very realistic.
Yeah, please.
Not required. Do you have any identifiers for the fact whether a gender equity exists in a particular sector? I'm asking this from the perspective of, in various sectors of national endeavor, whether it is in education, in health, in defense, there's always a talk of gender equity, but how do you identify whether a particular sector has actually achieved the optimum gender equity or not? Is it 50%, 30%, 70%? What should be the men to women ratio depending on a particular sector? Do you have any inputs on that?
The honest answer is it should 50-50 will always be strongest, but that's not going to happen. There are many instances where people will also say, oh, the textile industry is very gender equal. I actually disagree with that. It's because the textile industry is if you look at Bangladesh's textile industry, most of the clothes we make are, put together by a woman in some way, shape, or form. And I don't think that's empowerment or equality. It's because those are low-paying, low-skill jobs that they've been pushed into the manufacturing sector, whereas most of the men shifted to the service sector. And again, I don't think that is optimal just because there are more women. I do think if there was more of a balance, there would be more rights given to those workers. We wouldn't have cases like Rana Plaza where buildings are collapsing because men inherently have more negotiation power. They have more, Male bonded groups is something that I try to learn a lot from. You guys support each other better than we do, unfortunately. Unionization is much more effective in industries which have men in them because they will back each other and they will not stand down. Whereas women have so much more to lose because we fought so hard to get to where we are that we will not sacrifice it for another woman. And it's unfortunate. And that's one of the things. And again, that doesn't help anyone. You have a textile industry that can crumble very fast. And on the other side, you have a service industry which doesn't have enough women. So when an economy wants to grow, suddenly half the population, it doesn't have the skills to grow. And so I think that balance is going to be hard to achieve. I don't think just replacing men with women is optimal or the other way around. And I think I truly think as 50-50 as you can get is probably optimal. There are some sectors like wild capture fisheries. There's no way a woman is going to go on a boat or across the sea to go capture fish. She will be at risk for gender-based violence unless you change the whole system of how she will be protected. She's not going to do that. So usually within supply chains, you can build equality. You will have women doing the onshore cleaning and manufacturing and processing, and you'll have men going out to do the wild capture fish, and you can create gender equality in that way. So we do also need to be strategic because there are these cultural and social issues that will not permit us to just say, let's put 50% of the people on this boat have to be women. It's maybe not the right answer. Same way, are we going to send 50% of women to a remote location if we don't have the infrastructure set up for women in that case? Again, I come from a defense family as well. Probably not the right idea. Maybe many, many years down the line. I should have had a simpler answer, but it's complicated. It's a good question.
Puspa, yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I had a question along the same line, and I was still grappling, trying to understand. Perhaps appreciate your clarification in that. Because in some of your examples, I think you said that I tend to understand that women bring different kind of perspectives to the table, and therefore having women will make a difference in whether it's a negotiation or whatever. But then in other examples also, I think you said that it is not necessary that becoming a woman has to be a pro-feminist and a man would be anti-feminist, right?
Yeah.
So how do you grapple with this kind of a complexity of whether you want to have more women or whether you want to have more ideas that are pro more women? So in like real life examples, how do you deal with this complexity?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating question. And I think, one of the things when you study, one of my favorite subjects has always been philosophy is you also don't want to use women as a means to an end. Is she just there because she's more likely, in microfinance, a big case was invest in women because she will save the money and send her kids to school and break the cycle of poverty. It was not just invest in women because they don't have the same access to resources as men. And so we're losing on entrepreneurship. Those are very different arguments. For me, I think the arguments when I think about my investment hat is always how do you shift women from being victims to empowering them to be solutions? So I think that's very important. And then, yes, you do want women to be empowered for the sake of them being empowered, but not because you are saving them, but because you are empowering them by rights and because it's going to have a positive impact on your investment as well. Now, there are many cases, why I say it's not just about putting a woman leader, I'm trying to pick one that's the least controversial because this is recorded. So Ibu Susi, she was the fisheries minister in Indonesia. I met her a few years ago when I was doing a piece on sustainable fishing. And she told me she had just finished blowing up a Chinese vessel. So, and she did that because they entered her territory. She made people disembark from the boat, but she blew up the vessel. So it's not that just because she's a woman, she's not going to choose a violent course of action. She's in a system where if she does not take drastic action, China will keep coming and fishing in Indonesia's waters. And so that is the kind of system we need to change, is inherently, are we in a system that is, guided by, going back to Athena and Ares, of this brute force being the only way we can win? Or can we create systems where there is more equality in general? and starting with gender equality, but where there is more respect for borders, respect for different ethnicities, different beliefs, and then, of course, different genders. And if we create that system, there may be less need for her to go and blow up the boat. Maybe she could have gone into a negotiation settings with China. But China, of course, went the other direction. There's now not the 9- line, there's an 11- line. India's waters are also apparently in this line where China can fish. So I understand where she was coming from when she blew up the boat. So that's why I say it's not always that a woman will just be more peaceful. She will act the way the system has been designed. And systems tend to be more peaceful and more stable and more resilient when they are gender equal. That's the argument, I guess.
Natasha, I'm mindful that you have to go and attend a call, and I think we have really made you work very hard, So let me draw this conversation to an end out here, and thank you very much. And I honestly think that from the time when we began and now the time that we have passed, the condition around us has become much more comfortable. I don't know whether the aircon has started functioning or is it a result of what you shared with us in terms of enlightened learning, but whichever way, maybe I should thank you for that as well. So thank you very much. Stay connected, and we hope to host you again in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. No, thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone coming to the room. I appreciate the fact that we have a fairly balanced room here. Makes me very happy. Thank you so much to everybody.